Hello, everyone, and welcome again virtually back to Laurel, Maryland. My name is Ann Bennett. I'm the Executive Director of the Laurel Historical Society, and I am joined, as we just heard from Monica Sturdivant and Riley Matson, who's the staff members at the Laurel Historical Society. And we are joined, in addition, with our guest speakers and panelists tonight to hear about some great new projects happening in Maryland, documenting Maryland recipes and food histories and memories. You might remember Kara from one of our fall webinars already. Kara is a food researcher and blogger, and she writes for the Old Line Plate, and she presented for our September webinar, and we do have that recording on our YouTube channel. I'll put that link in the chat in just a few minutes, but if you haven't had a chance to read or test some of the recipes that Kara has provided, either in her new cookbook or on her blog, we definitely encourage you to do that. And our main presenter tonight is Joyce White. Joyce is also a food historian and educator. She's on the board of the Hammond Harwood House down in Annapolis. And Joyce was also very instrumental in helping us with our current exhibit. So Joyce consulted with us for the food history exhibit. She did a lot of the research, loaned us a lot of materials. So if you go through the exhibit, a lot of that material came from her sources. And if you have been tempted to eat the cakes down in the historic basement kitchens, though bake food also came from Joyce. So you have her to thank for your cake cravings down in the basement. So I will pass it along to our panelists tonight. But again, I encourage you to put any questions or comments that you have for us in the chat or the Q&A box. And I thank you for joining us tonight. So Joyce, Kara, please take it away.
Okay, good evening, everybody. I'm so happy to be able to speak with you tonight about this exciting new project that I am working on called the Great Maryland Recipe Hunt. And I'm going to share my screen here and just give you a little bit of background information about it, and just lots of fun information that will hopefully inspire you to share your recipes. Okay, sorry, I'm just trying to get into the slideshow mode. So I'm trying to move my screen down so I can there we go. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see that. I'm gonna move that out of the way. Okay, so the Great Maryland Recipe Hunt, what is this thing? This is a project sponsored in part by the Maryland State Archives and the Hammond Harwood House Museum. So why are we doing this? And why are these two organizations involved? Well, there's some good information there to give you. So back before, the world changed as we knew it, back in 2019, Maria Day, who was one of the senior archivists at the Maryland State Archives, and I hatched this plan to have a collecting day where people could come to the archives and bring their recipes. So Maria wanted to have an opportunity to build up the collection of food traditions in Maryland at the archives. And we thought that this would be a really great idea. And we planned to do it in October of 2019, but then because of projects that she was working on that were taking up too much of her time, we had to push it off to the spring of 2020. And you all know what happened. So that never happened. One of the silver linings of lockdown was the fact that we started doing these Zoom webinars and communicating by Zoom. And so once things settled down again, we met again and decided that it would be a really good idea to maybe, instead of do one day, to have like a year where we just use remote communication to try to get the public to share their recipes. And we're also trying to do some in-person events and webinars like this as well to kind of complement the absolute website format of this, to add that personal touch as well. And events are really great because people love to talk about food and they love to talk about their food traditions. So definitely wanted to include that as well, but definitely wanted to also take advantage of the remote aspects of this. So oops. So why the Hammond Harwood House Museum? This is a circa 1774 grand dome house in Annapolis, in downtown Annapolis, right on Maryland Avenue. It's pretty close to one of the gates for the Naval Academy. So just to give you some perspective. And the reason that this was kind of a perfect fit is because in 1963, the Hammond Harwood House Association published a cookbook called Maryland's Way, the Hammond Harwood House Cookbook. And it was a collection of historic recipes that were found in manuscript or handwritten, I should say, recipe or receipt journals that women kept in the 18th and 19th centuries. They basically would write down recipes that they liked, either from a published cookbook or ones that were given to them from, from other, women, other, big house parties that they might have gone to where, they might have had a very well-trained cook. So they sometimes would be able to be successful in getting some of those recipes out of their hosts. And so these books are really great because they document food that people actually liked enough to write down, as opposed to, a cookbook that you could buy. Maybe you didn't actually make 95% of the recipes in that book. Maybe there were just a few that you make. And you probably all have cookbooks like this too, that there are some, recipes you go back to over and over again that you love, but others you would just never in a million years make. And so that's why these books are good, because they kind of show us the ones that they were more inclined to make, or we're making on a regular basis. So so that's part of the component of that book. And then they just went out and solicited recipes from Marylanders from across the state in the late 1950s. It was a 5-year project of collecting and testing recipes and putting it all together in this book. So with the approaching 60th anniversary of this book, which is was a very successful book. It, as I said, it took 5 years, and the key players for this book, or the key women who were involved in this book, were a former trustee named Frances Kelly, who lived in Anne Arundel County in West River, Cumberstone, and then Hope Andrews, who lived at the beautiful Tulip Hill Estate. She was the former president of Hammond Harwood House Association. A woman who's not credited in the book, but who we know from later newspaper articles, doing some research, was the cook for Tulip Hill, who worked for Hope Andrews. And this was an African-American woman named Alice Brown. And she tested a majority of the recipes in this cookbook. So really important to mention her too, even though her name's not in the book. She was definitely a key player in this. So they began testing recipes in 1958, and as I said, worked for 5 years and included over 700 recipes in the book. So it's a lot of recipes to get through. So again, not just historic ones, there are definitely 20th century recipes as well. The first edition was so well received that they reprinted it over and over again. And by the early 1980s, I found an article saying that they had sold over 100,000 copies, and that a copy had been sent to Prince Charles and Princess Diana on the occasion of their marriage. So the current King Charles has a copy of this book somewhere, I'm sure in the archives within the royal libraries there. So that's kind of fun too. So this is a great opportunity to kind of do a collecting again. So this I would call a new hunt for a new generation of Marylanders, right? We have, lots of traditional fare still popular within Maryland, but there are new recipes too, new ways of eating that have been imported into Maryland over the last 60 years, right? So hopefully this hunt will be able to seek out some of that new diversity and add a whole new element to Maryland's cooking and what that meant, right? We take we take for granted what Marylanders are eating now, but in 100, 200 years, people might not. It might not be so obvious to people what Marylanders were eating in the early 21st century, right? So it's up to us to keep this information intact for future generations, for researchers, for foodies, for anyone who is interested in food. So all of these recipes that are collected will be stored with the Maryland State Archives. So they will be preserved for, ad infinitum. So they will be, so it's a good way to get your name associated with Maryland history for future reference. So this project has also turned into a bit of an area or a way for me to kind of find a home for all the research that I've done. And so what I'm doing and what I'm adding to this collection as well are an assortment of documents that have references to Maryland food going back to the 17th century. Newspaper references, letters, memoirs in particular of African Americans who were enslaved and who were either escaped slavery or were writing just after emancipation, and were writing about their experiences. So they write about the deprivation of their lives. And it's really a great window into what it meant to be enslaved and to be dependent on slaveholders who may have, withheld food, that very important, need that we have, and how that affected people who were in that position. Similarly, there are a lot of oral histories that have been done in Maryland and St. Mary's City, and just all over. Works Progress Administration, slave narratives. So during the Great Depression, writers, people like me, historians, went out and interviewed the general public all over the country, and were writing down traditions, and of which foodways, of course, was a big part of that. So you get a lot of information about that. But they also, a very important aspect of that project was interviewing former enslaved people who, spoke about their experiences. Some, there's some controversy about whether or not they were always telling the truth, depending on who they were being interviewed by. But nevertheless, it's still a really good resource to have. And then, of course, more of those manuscript receipt books, and many other sources. So it's going to be this huge collection of Maryland foodways, from as early as we can get it to go back. And so that's a really exciting part of this process for me. So I want to just go through some of the mechanics now on how to submit a recipe. And it's really simple. I think it's simple. You go to the website, marylandrecipes.org, and this will be the top of the page that you'll see, and you'll see it has different links at the top. And what you would need to do is go to where it says submit recipe. And you hit that, and so I have it highlighted in yellow there. And then it will take you to this page. And this page is the online submission form. So you would fill in all the fields. So the ones with an asterisk are the ones that you have to fill out in order for you to actually be able to transmit the submission. It won't let you send unless you do that. And we're just asking for your name and your email address, the name of the food or drink. And by the way, it doesn't have to actually be a recipe. If it's just a memory of an oyster feast that you went to, or a clam bake, or a cookie baking party for Christmas, or anything at all, any kind of recollection or memory is actually, for me as a an ethnographer, anthropologist, thinking person, almost more important than the recipe itself, because it tells me about when that food was eaten, what it means to you, right? Those memories associated with it. Recipe's not going to tell me that, but your memories will. So that's really important. I also want you to include the region or city from Maryland that this recipe or memory is associated with, because that will kind of help give us, a little regional flavor to Maryland's food as well. And then, of course, you'll be able to go in and put the recipe. There's also a link for you at the bottom. If you say you've got something on a Microsoft document or any kind of document, and you want to scan it in, or you just want to upload it that way, you can do that as well. But then what you do have to do, there are 2 questions here. It says, these are permissions. I understand all information, images submitted will become the property of Hammond Harwood House Museum and Maryland State Archives. You need to type in yes there. And then I understand information images submitted will be made available to the public and may be shared with the public online or in print. And you need to type yes there as well. That just gives us those permissions to house and store and to share the information with the general public. It doesn't mean that you're signing over rights to us. And that means that you no longer have rights to that recipe. It just gives us permission to share it. So now I want to talk about some of the results we've gotten. We started the hunt back in September. September 1st was the first launch, the official launch of the hunt. And so I want to share some of those. And by the way, the hunt will also run through August of 2023. So it's a full year. So you have lots of time, but I really want you to submit your recipes as soon as possible because I'm really anxious to see what people are, thinking about submitting. So this was submitted by Margaret Radford of Annapolis of Anne Arundel County. And hers, again, is not a recipe. It's just a memory. She talks about this oyster roast in Anne Arundel County she'd go to. We always had an oyster roast on Thanksgiving Day and many other times over the winter when oysters are in season. You make a wood fire and put a grate over it. Put big pieces of burlap in a bucket of water near the fire. Put the oysters on the grate, wring out the burlap and spread it over the oysters. The oysters will open as they cook from the fire below and from the steam on top from the burlap. They get a lot of smoky flavor and they're really delicious. I didn't care for oysters when I was very young, but when I was a teenager, I decided I'd learn to like them because the adults were having so much fun around the fire. So to me, that is like golden because it gives me her feelings that this memory engenders. It also gives me process here, how this oyster roast took place. And that's really important, especially when we're talking about folk traditions, because you might also participate in oyster roast, but you might do it a little differently. You might think yours is the right way. Margaret might think hers is the right way, but guess what? Everyone's is the right way. Part of our folk traditions, when we learn by observation and imitation, what inevitably comes with that is repetition, of course, but variation, right? We vary things to our own particular needs, logistics, tastes, that sort of thing. And if we don't make those changes, then traditions tend to die out because if they're not going to work for us, why do them, right? But if you can tweak it a little bit to make it work for you, then you will continue that tradition. Here's another recipe. This is particularly interesting to me because not only did I get one recipe from the Pregel-Miller family, I got a whole book. I got a 1840s manuscript receipt book that belonged to an ancestor of the family who donated it, a woman from Anne Arundel County, Margaret Selman Brogdon. And when I showed this to Maria Day from the archives, she was ecstatic because she knows that family name. She was a very important family in Anne Arundel County. So she, was able to really feel like this hunt is being, worthwhile because not only did this family give us this 1840s manuscript receipt book, but they have another one from the 1890s that I haven't scanned and looked at yet, but it has a lot of World War I ration recipes in it and things of that nature. So I'll probably be getting that one soon. And that just speaks to women's history as well. It's not just the food history, so very complex. So here, this recipe for oyster soup, again, everybody's got their own version of it. Another submission I got was from Janet Pareco from Calvert County. And she also talks about the tradition that goes with her family's crab feasts. And I'm not going to read the whole exact thing to you because it's very long, and I will be posting this on the website shortly. But she talks about how the family gets together on the porch overlooking the bay, and they have this ritual every year where they sit around and they pick the crabs. And then I'll just read you part of it here. They put on the table salted butter, apple cider vinegar, extra Old Bay or Lawry seasoning. And, they go through this process of dipping it with either butter or vinegar and dipping it in the seasonings. And then after they're stuffed and they've had enough of the picking of the crab, whatever crab meat is left, they then turn into a crab dip. So her recipe submission was actually the recipe for that leftover crab meat, which is very fun. And to kind of move from seafood to another important staple product within a Maryland food tradition is corn, or Indian corn, or cornbread in this case, or a corn pone. And this was submitted by Billy Gray of Worcester County. And she writes, my mother learned this recipe when she was in high school, which would have been about 1935. She watched her aunt make the recipe and took notes to create a recipe with measurements. Excuse me, that's really important because a lot of these early recipes are what we call aides memoire. They weren't written in the way that you would expect a recipe to be written today. They were just, a collection of ingredients, maybe without any measurements at all. Or maybe they had the ingredients with the measurements, but there were no directions. Or maybe there were some ingredients with some measurements for ingredients and some directions, but very incomplete. So basically the skill of the cook, really played a big part in how well the recipe was executed. Experience and skill in the kitchen were essential. Plus, I think there was this assumption that you just knew what to do, right? You didn't have microwave meals or fast food restaurants. If you wanted to eat and you didn't have a huge amount of money to hire a cook or even to go out to a restaurant, which would have been a very unusual situation, right? You had to know how to cook. And if you wanted it to taste good, you pretty much had to figure out how to make these recipes, whether or not the written recipe was complete or not. So there was definitely that assumption. So this is for a quick corn pone or spoon bread with yellow cornmeal. So that tells me this recipe is probably a little bit later, maybe late 19th century, because white cornmeal was the primary cornmeal from the earlier days. So you pretty much make a cornmeal mush with hot water, and then you add salt and some sweetener and butter and milk, and then to bind it all together, you add an egg and you bake it, and then you can cut it up and eat it fresh. You can serve it later as well. You can even grill it. And I like at the bottom too here, again, that variation. Due to the number of diabetics in the family, I skipped the sweetener. One diabetic cousin uses 2 teaspoons Splenda. Other members of the family use up to 1 1/4 cups of sugar. So again, that variation makes the tradition last. This was a fun one. So Claudia Casoulas of Montgomery County, who also just wrote a cookbook or a book on Montgomery County's food history, she found this recipe and she submitted this recipe called Sandy Spring Post Office Bread. And I love this story. First of all, it's a Quaker recipe. Sandy Spring was a Quaker community. I found this recipe at the Sandy Spring Museum archives while doing research for another project. Archivist Derek Jackson told me the story. In the late 1800s, the postman went from farm to farm delivering mail and arrived at one house just as the bread was coming out of the oven. The cook gave him a loaf and he shared the bread at each house. People liked it and the recipe was shared as well. I've made it with a few adjustments and it's a nice basic white bread loaf. But that's like such a sweet story to go along with that recipe. And here's the recipe for the bread. Again, very simple, just basic white bread recipe. But the story is so important. Janet Medina of Montgomery County, well, I believe she lives in DC, but her family settled in Montgomery County from New York, has Venezuelan roots. And so she submitted this recipe for these Venezuelan type of tamale, essentially, called hallacas. She writes, I grew up in New York City in a culturally, linguistically, racially, and ethnically mixed family. My parents moved to Maryland in the late 1970s, and my husband and children and I moved to Maryland in the late 1990s. My grandmother was from Venezuela, and she and her sister, my great aunt, ruled the kitchen. One dish that was always prepared around Christmas time at my father's parents' house were hallacas, Venezuelan packages of meaty goodness, something like a tamal, but unique in its own way. So time-consuming, they are typically only made around Christmas in Venezuela and require a gathering of people to assemble, cook, and eat. If friends are here, we put them to work on any task they want. No one gets to just sit and watch. Hallaca making was and is usually accompanied by music, laughter, lots of talk, and sometimes the intermittent dance or two. So can you imagine that, liveliness of the kitchen with everybody working together to produce food for this special occasion. She also submitted recipe for Venezuelan black bean soup. So, you can submit recipes. The reason I've put these up here too is that they don't have to be these classic, crab and oyster recipes that you think of when you think of Maryland. And this recipe for a carrot halva is from an Indian tradition, and I love the story behind this too. So this was submitted by Sudha Bhagwat Haley, and I hope I didn't butcher her name too much. Served for Diwali, the Indian festival of lights, celebrated in autumn by billions across the globe. It hails victory of good over evil and light over darkness. As we share our lamps in the darkness and ate our sweet Indian desserts with family and friends, we knew we were experiencing a holiday of hope. In our household, there were several hired cooks, so I did not learn to cook in India before coming to the United States for my undergraduate education. Fast forward to 3 days after receiving our bachelor's degrees, at age 19, I was married to my American husband. He loved Indian food, so I frantically called my mother for my favorite recipes, especially the sweet Gazar carrot halva, which is a confectionery sweetened with honey. When we serve it to family and friends, like I do on each Diwali holiday, Indians say, "Eat my sweets and say sweet things about me." I don't know if this picture is accurate. Sudha did not submit a picture, but I think that's what this looks like. But again, I just love that story. Here's another submission of an Asian specialty made in Maryland. It's a Hunan steamed sea bass by Jenny Shia Gao from Montgomery County. I have lived in America for 22 years, 17 of these years in Maryland. I have never lived anywhere longer than this, so I consider myself a Marylander. I grew up in China in Hunan province, a place known as the land of rice and fish. I love the aroma, look, and taste of great food that is healthy and fresh. I'm particularly fond of fish. Chinese people believe that fish is also good for the brain. In Mandarin Chinese, the word fish is pronounced yu, which is the same pronunciation as the word surplus. So eating fish symbolizes wealth and prosperity in the coming year. During the Lunar New Year, our family always cooks steamed fish, whole fish with head and tail. And this recipe looks really delicious. It's got tofu, black bean, garlic sauce, rice wine, sesame or olive oil, soy sauce, fresh ginger, garlic, sugar, onions, and cilantro. So really lovely submission there. Now I just want to switch gears a little bit because of the 60th anniversary of the publication of the Maryland's Way Cookbook. I just want to bring to your attention to a second project that's happening, which is sort of, is all of these are working together, but this is definitely a separate project. We're producing a companion book to that original cookbook that was made 60 years ago to really highlight the cultural diversity found in Maryland's early foundational cuisine, right? So Maryland's Way Cookbook has diversity in it. It's not acknowledged, right? The Native American, African American contributions to Maryland's cuisine kind of get overshadowed by the European or British influences, but they're there and they're really prominent if you know what to look for. Other early cultural traditions that helped to develop Maryland's early cuisine are German, Pennsylvania German, meaning, and not just meaning Amish or Mennonite, which you'd normally think of right when you go to those Amish markets. But Pennsylvania German actually represents a much larger group of Germans who were of the Reformed or Lutheran traditions, so not Catholic, who broke away from the Catholic Church. And so, it's just, it's a very wide, expansive group of people. And also Germans who were Jewish came to Maryland in the, pretty early on and had a pretty significant influence in Maryland's food. If you like burger cookies, if you like Old Bay, right, they're all from German sources. So that's really important. So this book is going to really try to highlight this diversity We're going to do it in a variety of ways. It's going to be a fun book. It's not going to be like this academic tome, but we're going to look at a lot of Native American ingredients that are, rampant throughout the book. Of course, Indian corn and hominy, which is a processed, a way of processing Indian corn. Beans, squash, pumpkins, huckleberries, chestnuts, black walnuts, Jerusalem artichokes, of course, all of the local Chesapeake seafood and fish, and tons of wild game, muskrat, canvasback duck, terrapin, of course, all those classic items in Maryland's cuisine. We're also going to look at that African-American influence. So of course, there are ingredients that are associated with African-Americans in early Maryland, like hot red peppers, stuffed ham, okra, Baltimore fish pepper, a variety of sweet potato dishes, eggs, and poultry. But this book is also going to highlight the enslaved workforce, particularly at Hammond Harwood House, because research was done recently that uncovered names of known enslaved, 3 women who worked there. And then I recently found another reference to an African-American boy who was seized to pay taxes for the owner of the house at the time in the 19th century. Turned out he wasn't actually owned by the Hammond Harwood House owner, Richard Lockerman. He was being hired out by Richard Lockerman, was owned by somebody else. So there was this fight. It's all documented in the newspaper. And the other part of this is to really highlight the exceptional job of and skill of the enslaved cooks in these, high-powered homes. Right? These cooks were cooking for the leaders of Annapolis, especially in downtown Annapolis, when the legislation was in session. And they had to have great skill in the kitchen. Remember, I talked about how those recipes were really just these aides memoire, that we didn't have specific directions. You had to know how to do this. You had to have skill and you had to have intuition in the kitchen, and just that lengthy experience. And these cooks were producing haute cuisine. They really were. So that in itself made a huge influence on shaping Maryland's cuisine. Pennsylvania German and Jewish, other things in the book that we see: scrapple, liver puddings, Amish bun, sauerkraut. Any of you have sauerkraut with your turkey at Thanksgiving? You got to know that's very unusual, right? That's a real German, maybe Polish, other Eastern European contribution to the Baltimore area as well, and lots of other cabbage dishes as well. Potato pancakes, right? Latkes. So these all stem from that cultural tradition. And of course, all this is sitting on this, European, largely British influence or dictates, right? A huge preference for things like pies, a variety of different breads, sausages, puddings, preserves, pickles, sausage, creams, jellies, the list goes on. But none of the British foundations would have survived on their own without all of these other influences as well. So this book, this companion book, will be bringing that all together. And perhaps some of the recollections from that we gain from the recipe hunt may wind up in this book as little, asides, little stories, vignettes. I'm trying to, piece that all together and make it all work together. So now I'm going to kind of stop sharing now for just a second. Anne wants to talk a little bit about why she wants me to talk about faux food.
Yeah. Okay, there we go. Yeah. Thank you, Joyce. And yeah, just as we pause and shift gears just a little bit, I encourage everyone to put into the chat, get your, thinking caps on and put into the chat some of your favorite Maryland recipes or your favorite foods. You don't necessarily have to go and hunt down and type out the recipe for us, but I would be really interested in hearing, what your favorite Maryland food is, or your dish, or what you remember, or if you're not in Maryland anymore, what do you miss? What do you wish we could send you? Is it the burger cookies? Is it the Old Bay? So yeah, just kind of think about that. But yeah, so I hope you've been enjoying hearing about, like the intersection of all these different projects and everything like that. And There's just a lot of great history in Maryland, and I wanted to show my copy of the Maryland of the Maryland's Way cookbook. I think I forget where I got it from, but it's one of the early 1960s copies. So it's a great resource, like Joyce mentioned. But there's just so many other stories. And as we were researching the food history exhibit here in Laurel, we just realized that there's just so much history in kind of this hyper local focus, and taking a cue from what Joyce said about going into the archives and just finding little food references here or there, even with the archival material that we have, which is a lot of like ledger books related to like hotels or stores, transactions. We do have city directories like from the late 1800s. All of these have tantalizing little clues to Maryland foodways and what Laurelites were eating and were available to purchase in years past. So, for example, we have the diary of the mill superintendent, George Nye, who was in charge of the mill in the 1870s and 1880s. And we have a couple of his diaries in our collection. And as you go through, he was very regular about keeping diaries. And you'll see every now and then, oh, he bought a pineapple. And you're like, oh wow, pineapple and Laurel in like 1880 is very exciting. Or he might talk about going and taking tea with somebody you're going to visit, and just kind of thinking about the material culture and the food that all these different people in Laurel were eating. And so that was really kind of exciting to go just beyond the exhibit display, which is fantastic. But once you start diving deeply into these archival records, then you think about what life was like and what people were eating, and especially Joyce had mentioned the oysters earlier. We find a lot of those archaeologically as well, right in the backyard of the Laurel Museum, up the block at the site of the Pilate High School that we're doing some archaeological investigations at. So there's this hints all around of this foodways, and so that's what's so exciting to see bits of those past come to life, and to talk about the current project as well. But as we went through and did that exhibit, and we were working with Joyce, something that really exemplifies it and helps to visualize what people are eating. And one of the important components of the exhibit that Joyce did for us was that she talked about, the changing American taste and the palates, and what recipes and spices and combinations of different foods were popular 50, 100, 200 years ago, are not necessarily what our modern taste buds would enjoy. And so as we were looking at that changing American taste and the commercialization and the industrialization that came along with that, we thought it was really interesting to not only just kind of talk about that, but to share it. So down in our historic basement kitchens, we have a display on 19th century mid-Victorian era kitchens, and then we also have the equivalent about 100 years later. So we have a fun mid-century modern display that you'll be able to see, not quite yet because Poe is in the basement, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But again, one of the things that helps to visualize that and what people were eating is this fake food. And I've just always loved going to different house museums and just seeing all the fake food at the table, because it really kind of takes you back into time, and you can just imagine people having just stepped away from the dining table, or having a conversation over a tea table or something like that. And so Joyce said that she could do that, and she can make fake food. So we have a ginger cake, we have some blancmange, I think we have a couple molds that were based off of that's used to make the fake foods from. We have a minced pineapple cake, I think, from the 1950s, which is again a very interesting palette combination. But yeah, again, so that was really a kind of a bonus in working with Joyce, was that she's able to kind of bring these visually to life, and it goes beyond just the research, and it kind of helps bring these little tidbits of information we're getting from manuscript cookbooks or ledgers or newspaper articles. I know that that's one of Kara's specialties, is going through newspapers and pulling out little recipes or names and where people are living. So I didn't know if you wanted to talk about that in a little bit, Kara, but or now if you wanted to do that, Joyce, and I hope you brought
No,
some.
that Kara, yeah, that Kara,
Okay.
Karen's got some really
But
good.
yeah, so I know when Kara joined us last time in September, a lot of what you blew us away with was like, drilling down into Laurel and how so much of this information is in the newspaper. So I guess that was kind of my, question to you was that, how much of what Joyce is saying in terms of, documentation of Maryland's foodways and these stories have you come across in your newspaper searches, and have you come across anything exciting recently?
Newspapers definitely help fill in the gaps. Not to go on too much of a tangent, but when Joyce was talking about this project, I just get so excited because when you start researching this history, you start to find all these gaps in what gets documented. And the Maryland State Archives actually already has some recipes, but they're from very specific people. So it's so exciting that this project is happening to create something that's a little bit more inclusive so that the future me or the future Joyce will get an accurate picture.
Right.
Newspapers do represent, especially as you get a little bit later on, you have people who write in to request recipes or people who mail in the recipes and home economists. So they're a little bit more or less upper crust than some of these very old cookbooks and manuscripts. You have a lot of everyday people. Sometimes they'll share stories about their lives along with the recipes. So I really like digging through those just because you really start to see this development of a time when people really bring their personalities into the recipes. In old newspapers in the 1800s, you'd find these little recipes printed with not much to say. And as time goes on throughout the 50s and through now, when you find a recipe, you often find someone's life story alongside it. So I think the interest has always been there, but there's a lot more recognition of it now and a lot more realization that readers are interested in the recipe and the story behind it.
Yeah, it's so important to have those stories to share, to just put those recipes in context of how people were actually using them and where they were using them, where they were making them. And that's why, and I love that repetition and variation because, as people move from one place to another, right, especially if you come here from another country, maybe you can't get all the ingredients, so you have to adapt it. Right? If you want to keep making that recipe, you have to kind of come up with some kind of substitution for whatever ingredient you can't find, you can't get, or maybe you'll add an ingredient. Like when I moved to Maryland I'm in New York Italian, I make stuffed mushrooms, so I decided to add some crab meat to that recipe, and I hosted a family reunion at my house with all my Italian relatives, and they still rave. That was in 2010, and they still rave about those mushrooms and want to come back and have more of those stuffed crab mushrooms. So, took a recipe from traditional New York Italian family and gave it a Maryland twist. So, if you have recipes like that, share them. Even if you're not like a natural cook and you use cookbooks, you're still kind of putting your stamp on a recipe. You're still right or serving a particular recipe maybe for a special occasion. I want to know that, even if it comes from a cookbook. I want to know what makes you tick, like what recipes your family beg you to make, or if you have kids who go away to college, when they come home like, oh, please make this or make that. Like my kids always want like chicken cutlets or meatballs, whatever. What recipes do your family crave? And why? What is that memory that is associated with it?
Yeah.
So, and if you have recipes or memories and you want to share them in the chat, that'd be great. But I really do want to encourage you to go to the website and submit them because the more we get, the better. I know that, again, Maria at the archives is, really hoping to bulk up this collection so that it's a nice, like time capsule in a way of what people were eating in the early 21st century.
Yeah, and back to the newspaper recipes, when I researched some of these things that my family makes, that I didn't really know the history of. And you hear your parents talk about it or make it when you're a kid, and you might think it's something ancient. I actually found that most of our very sacred family recipes came from newspapers in the 1960s and 70s.
Yeah.
And at first that feels a little deflating, but as time goes on and I've done more research, they're every bit as important. And
Yeah.
some of them contain artificial vanilla flavoring or things like that, but they're every bit as important to my family as if they were somebody's antebellum recipe or something.
Absolutely. Oh, I see somebody wrote something in the chat. Lifelong Marylander always had sauerkraut at Thanksgiving. Yeah. And oyster stuffing. When I moved here from New York, I thought that was the strangest thing. My grandmother made a chicken and rice dish using saffron or curry, and many in the family have tried, but we haven't been able to replicate it. Oh, that's sad. I'm thinking she have been using an ingredient that isn't used or available anymore. Yeah, that's possible. Or the curry she used maybe was a different blend, because a curry is a blend of spices. So it might have been a different type of curry. But yeah, that's sweet. So go to the website and please submit that. You can just cut and paste what you just wrote there and submit it into the website so I can use it and get those permissions. It's really important that you do it through the website so that we have those permissions on record.
Yeah. So Joyce, a question for you that has come up a little bit as I've been talking to people about the project. So it can be any recipe really, like that's eaten in Maryland. It doesn't have to be
anything
like
that
the crabs or anything
Yeah.
like that, right?
No, it can be anything that you enact, right? We're going to use ethnography terms. You enact a tradition, right? You don't how many people in a folk group? Two people, and actually one really, if you cook for yourself. If it's something you make on a regular basis for certain events, if it's part of your family's culture in Maryland, that's important. It's, why should we just give crab and oysters and corn and all, tomato, all of that is great, but it's no longer a predominant part of the food anymore, right? Because we have so many other food traditions coming here. So let's talk about those as well. I would love to get some really good Hispanic recipes, more not just Venezuelan. That's great. I love it. Never expected that. But, Mexican, El Salvadoran. I'd love to get Ethiopian from like the Silver Spring area. There's so many different places in this state that have, little pockets of these cultural traditions that if we don't document them, we're going to forget about it as people move around again. We all think it's going to stay the same as it is now, but it's not. It's going to be changing continually. And even like to get those the Ethiopian recipes or Nigerian recipes is so important because African American is not the same as African, right? People who come over recently, bringing their traditions, it's going to be different from an African American family who's can trace their ancestors back, 300 years or whatever. You know what I mean? Like it's going to be different. So I want to know what that is. What are you eating? All of that's important.
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, because it just hits, especially on Laurel. There's just so many great food traditions, and new restaurants are always opening up, little bakeries and shops. And Laurel Lights love their food, so we're always excited when
I
new
wonder
places
too,
open up.
Yeah, if you see more and more food trucks now, if more
Mhm.
people are trying their hand at commercializing their cultural traditions, then maybe we're seeing more foods now, more variety of foods now than before. I mean, I went to I've been to a couple events where I think it's a Jamaican food truck and they serve goat in Maryland. That's amazing. So I'd love to see more of that, kind of shock me in a way. Like I'd like to see that.
I have a goat story. I can share that with you, surprisingly. went to a goat barbecue in Joppa. So
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
who knew? But
Oh, no.
yeah, there's just such great variety, and I'm glad to hear that there's the historical precedents stemming from the 1960s cookbook and documenting all those foodways from hundreds of years back. But like you said, there's just so much going on nowadays, and it's our job to document it now so that
Right.
100 years from now someone else is going to do the same thing we're doing now. So
Yeah. Oh, it looks like somebody else put something in the chat.
yeah, go, sorry, go ahead.
It says, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Grandma made something called Dutchman's Mess. Have you ever heard of it? No. Some type of stewed tomato dish and something called wilted lettuce, which I'm pretty sure was bacon grease poured over lettuce. LOL. My husband loved both when he came into our family, but thought they were very strange dishes, and he was a Marylander too. So they must have been dishes that she was brought up on, or use everything, don't throw anything away thinking.
Yeah, I've seen other messes. I don't think I've seen Dutchman's in particular. Kara, have you seen that one?
No, I should search my database, but probably not. I have heard of the lettuce. Reminds me kind of what they would do with kale and like Appalachian stuff. But yeah, the mess could be anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fun. And I love how the husband thought it was very strange.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's true. And I think it's great because we all kind of have stories like that. I didn't grow up in Maryland, and when I came here with my family and as I grew older, you kind of pick up more and more on these things. So we had a close family friend that did the turkey in the brown paper bag and had sauerkraut with their Thanksgiving meal. And then I remember the Watergate salad, like that was a Maryland thing, and I never had that before. So these are it's just some really great little fun things that you're just really kind of jogging my memory. So I would encourage everyone, go to the website, put it in, go and submit it to Joyce so we can document it. But also come to the museum. We would love to hear about it too. And we can help you submit it through the website, or we can document it there for you and submit it on your behalf, or just sit down and talk with us, because it's a great way just to kind of meet new people and reconnect after being virtual for so long. So definitely come to the museum.
Yeah, I would love, like I said, before we started the webinar, I would love to have, a day actually to do that original plan of having, days where, I come with my computer set up, even have a scanner, and you can just come and bring your recipes, and then you could just old fashioned, you could just sign the permission form. Yep. We did that for the Oyster Fest in St. Michael's a couple of weeks ago. And now I haven't gone through them. I'm going to get a headache probably trying to read people's handwriting. So it was outside, but it would be nice, having the computer, and we could talk to you, and, we could type as we're talking, and, get that information about the story. I think that would be fun too.
Well, I am going to just take a quick pause. I'm going to go through our announcements, and then we'll come back and we'll continue the conversation and hit any other questions that we might have. So if you give me just 1 second here, I'm going to try to share the slides again. Okay, this looks a little more normal than it did last time. I just found this real quick as we were talking earlier. This is the mid-century modern side of our kitchen. And if you see on the little cake stand, you'll see one of Joyce's creation. And that is, again, a 1950s era mince and pineapple cake. So we have a copy of the recipe that Joyce shared with us. So that's just kind of a little tableau that she helped to stage for us. And we really thought it was nice to kind of juxtapose, like, how do you make a cake in the 1850s? How did you make a cake in the 1950s, and then go back a century into the 1840s, 1850s. And that's what you see on the left-hand side there. So we have the display, and then in the middle, the kind of the ginger cake, I believe, that Joyce made with a nice icing there, as well as some of the tools that look a little different than the 1950s. Then on the sideboard, we have some really fun kind of just explorer boxes, I guess, with some of the other creations that Joyce just made there with her mold. So that's kind of what we have on display there. So I just wanted to throw that visual out just to plug Joyce's creativity with the baked foods. But just real quick before we end, I just want to go through again and just say we do have just a few more programs as we wind down our program year for 2022. In next week, I will be at the Laurel Library talking about 12th Night for our Foods of Fiction series, kind of just talking about the plots of books and all the food that's mentioned in them, and then the historical and literary context. And then wrapping up the year on December 14th with one of my favorites, A Christmas Carol. So I hope you join us there. You don't have to pre-register, just show up. It starts at 6:30 at the Laurel Library. And then I had mentioned briefly, and there was a question in the chat earlier, we do have Poe in our basement. So you will not be able to see the 1950s kitchen. We kind of pushed that to the side, but we're really happy to welcome Poe back to Laurel. Last year, we had the Edgar Allan Poe exhibit as a traveling display, part history, part art installation from the Poe House, Baltimore. And this year we welcome them again, this time featuring Virginia Clem Poe on the 200th anniversary of her birthday in 1822. And so that's included with the exhibit that you'll see, our food history exhibits, and it will be open for another week or so through November 27th. And just note that we are closed that Friday after Thanksgiving. And then finally, we have our holiday open house the first weekend in December, as we've had for quite a few years now. So again, it's just a nice way to get some shopping done for the holidays. And we have invited some of Laurel's best bakers to donate some of their homemade goodies for us. We're going to package those up so that you can purchase them and you can pass them off on your own. I'm not judging you there. So if you want to bring homemade goodies and you don't bake, stop by the Laurel Museum and pick up some treats from some of the other bakers in Laurel that have done that. And if you're interested to kick off that open house on that Thursday evening, we're going to be having an apron workshop and cookie exchange. And we encourage you to learn about aprons, get into the festive holiday mood, bring some festive foods and a recipe. And we'll make sure that that goes along with our recipe hunt collection. And then again, just finally, I'll put it back in the chat. But again, I encourage you to join or renew membership if you have not. It does help support us throughout the whole year, as well as to donate for the program tonight, or if you will consider contributing to our year-end campaign through the annual appeal of 2022. You can do that on our website as well. Just finally, this is the Christmas ornament or the holiday ornament that we have. It's actually a really great full color brass ornament that we have as part of our collectible ornament series. And it's an evergreen, so it would be great to display all year round, but it's focusing on our upcoming exhibit for 2023. It's called It's All Laurel. City limits and beyond. So as we think about the borders of Maryland and all the recipes and foodways that are in them, we encourage you to think of all the boundaries and borders and what is Laurel. And so we'll be exploring community history, neighborhoods in and around the greater Laurel area next year. And so I just want to say thank you. This is our contact information. If you have any questions or anything like that, please stop and see us. We do have the Poe exhibit up for a couple weeks, like I said, and then just in about another month or so, we'll be closing our food exhibit. So I hope you are able to join us. And yes, Joyce, I just saw Joyce's picture go by of her fake cake. So Kara, I think you had started to say something earlier, and I apologize because I was going right into my spiel with the events, but did you want to add anything before we close out and check the questions one more time?
I was making another plea for people to submit recipes, and it's just something that I got from my experience from doing my website and my book. Which is how much sometimes these recipes mean to other people down the line. Because I collect community cookbooks, and I have a few that I put in my book and on my website for like a Filipino recipe and for a Korean recipe. And it makes me really emotional because people have reached out to me to tell me how much it means to them to see these recipes. there. So I just wanted to add that because I think it's something people might not think of, it's not just about preserving it for you, but that it means a lot to people to see that representation there.
Yeah, I had a similar experience with this woman from the Montgomery County area who was sort of rallying her the Asian community to submit the recipes, and she was like, "Really, you want Chinese recipes? You want Asian recipes in Maryland?" I'm like, "Yeah, you make that food in Maryland? Yeah, then it's Maryland food." And she was so touched about that, that would be an honor. She said it would definitely be an honor to be included, to be able to include their recipes. So yeah, I think it makes people feel almost like welcome and at home, that this is their home and it should be treated that way. Their food should be treated as Maryland food.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful kind of note to end on. And again, I will reiterate Joyce and Kara's plea to pass along those recipes. Stop by the museum if you don't want to submit online. We'll help you get it to Joyce, and just really kind of go through your recipe collection, especially as the holidays are right around the corner. So I just want to thank Kara and Joyce for presenting and being with us tonight, and Monica and Riley as well. We had a nice full house tonight. And thank you everyone for joining us. I'm going to end the recording, but I will stick around for just another minute or so if anyone has any final questions or thoughts. But if not, then thank you so much, and have a wonderful holiday season with your wonderful Maryland recipes.
Thanks, Anne.
Thanks.